Jason. Thanks for being with us again.
Well, it's great to be with you guys again, and I hope that our conversations will continue long into the future.
Likewise. And I thought I had a copy of your book here to show, but it's in my room. So
here, I'll hold up a copy.
Okay, great.
And by the way, I have to say, Arctos did a hell of a job with design this time. The hardcover has an interior design underneath the dust jacket. Beautiful, beautiful job by Tor Westman at Arctos.
Very nice. I have the paperback. It's great. But I'd like to have had the inner architectural work. Yeah, it looks like one of those really good graphic novels that they put out that are high end, like a good color.
Yep.
Yeah, it's great.
I'll bring a copy to LA, Michael.
That'd be great. Yeah. Well, so I guess we can start anywhere. I mean, this book was it's very rich. It's very deep. I like to think of it as like an odyssey of conspiracies. When I use the term conspiracy or conspiracy theory, I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I could just as well be talking about an alternative or parallel narrative or occult or esoteric narrative or theory instead of conspiracy. But there's conspiracy theories and conspiracy facts, detailed and thorough investigation of that that's woven into the narrative. From ancient astronaut theory, civilization of Atlantis, we got the Martian civilization, Nazi UFOs, secret space programs, psychic spies. And one thing I want to say is that all kind of reminds me, Jason draws upon all this Faustian futurist in a way that kind of reminds me of the way modernist authors like Joyce, Thomas Mann, and T.S. Eliot drew on classical mythology. It's like conspiracy theories, particularly the ones that involve archetypal images like aliens, lost civilizations, planets. Not that there isn't something to those as well, as Jason will show it and talk about some of the evidence for some of the stuff. But those conspiracy theories I kind of think of as almost like the motifs of a kind of new contemporary mythology. And I think that that this book is kind of like a hero's journey, I suppose, for the hyper-modern era. I'll put it in a term that me and John like to use. So, Jason, do you want to say anything to that? Or John, does that light up anything for you?
Sure, I can say something about that. Now that I'm thinking about it, in response to the way that you characterize this novel, particularly with respect to all these, conspiratorial motifs and so forth, I realized that there is a certain quality to my work that begins in Prometheus and Atlas and has continued pretty consistently, especially in works like novel Folklore, and then this novel, which we can talk about later. This novel is, in essence, an attempt to practice novel Folklore rather than simply presenting it as a philosophical concept. But there is this quality in my work, going all the way back to Prometheus and Atlas, of a kind of, almost perverse mixture of highly intellectual, rigorous philosophical thought with carnivalesque, sort of like fantastical imagery and ideas. That's somewhat conscious and deliberate on my part. I think it's to some extent a reflection of our historical moment. I think it's one of the ways in which my writing is postmodern, insofar as, the classic distinctions between these genres have been obliterated through the process of deconstruction that's unfolded in the last several decades. But I also think that it has something to do with, again, this idea of novel folklore and an attempt to reach the subconscious and various non-rational processes in the mind of the reader to then address those aspects of the psyche with what is actually a very rigorous, complex philosophical message. So it's kind of a Trojan horse, as it were, this use of, conspiratorial, fantastical, phantasmagoric imagery that reaches way beneath the rational mind to then address that strata of the psyche with, some very transcendental philosophical ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Reminds me, when you put that, kind of reminds me of some of the things that Jacques Vallée would say about UFO experiences and how, say, if they're a control system that's trying to direct human consciousness in a certain way, then they're appealing to the subconscious mythical substructures by presenting us with images that are like of fairies, things that are out of folklore, things that are carnivalesque, as you said, in order to, or even the sexual imagery of abduction, which sexual imagery doesn't make any rational sense in terms of what an advanced technological civilization would be doing in terms of like genetic, taking sperm and ovum from abductees with these sort of medieval-like instruments, torture instruments, essentially, they're kind of using in some reports, unless it's meant to impress something on the mind, carnivalesque and erotic imagery that then allows some, like you said, transcendental philosophy to get deep into the mind. So that's interesting. And what you said about it being, what you're doing is a practice of novel folklore, which that also reminds me of one other thing. When you were here in LA, we talked about this briefly about how I think you introduced this in your Black Sun and Lovers of Sophia, your essay about this concept called Weltanschauungskrieg, probably not saying it right, which means worldview warfare, and how rather than conquering the world in terms of territory, well, why do that when you can actually conquer the worldview of people, of a society, and that the war for the worldview, and we sort of look at our civilization today with all the media that we're entrenched within as an instrument for that kind of warfare to take place in a really high way. But I guess what I'm getting at was that I wonder if the novel folklore how do I put this, of injecting certain ideas into society through the subconscious. I don't know if you want to say.
Yeah, let me say a few things about that before we see what John's reflections are. I have to say I do owe a debt to Vallée in terms of my development of the idea of novel folklore, and I am grateful for having had a brief opportunity to very closely interact with him. In fact, at his home one evening, where we discussed these ideas. And so, Vallée, among others, Nietzsche, Heidegger, to some extent, even William James, were resources for my development of this. Wittgenstein as well, with his whole notion of language games, were resources in my development of this idea that it may be possible to deliberately engineer folklore, which is paradoxical because, of course, folklore emerges from out of the collective unconscious. I mean, it's a quintessentially unconscious process. So, and then, as Heidegger understood well, folklore is the matrix from out of which all of the other more structured, rational ideas of a culture emerge, including, the deep structure of its political constitution. And so if you could deliberately re-engineer folklore and create a novel folklore, then you could redirect the historical trajectory of a people or of a whole civilization. And, this is an idea that, in part, I developed under the influence of Vallée. So you're very right to point to, his Passport to Magonia and other works where he suggests that this might be what's going on behind the UFO phenomenon. And then I also wanted to mention that what was the thing? You went from Vallée to where was it after that?
Well, the Weltanschauung.
Oh yes. So in Black Sunrise, right? in the essay Black Sunrise and Lovers of Sophia, I developed this concept of, well, actually, what I claim is that I'm reverse engineering or reconstructing a concept that is at least tacitly being implemented by an occulted elite, namely the concept of abbauende Aufbruch ins Weltanschauungskrieg. So Weltanschauungskrieg means, as we've discussed in previous conversations, worldview warfare, and it's the term that, the American military developed psychological warfare on the basis of. And psychological warfare is a really kind of deracinated, debased translation of Weltanschauungskrieg, because the idea of Weltanschauungskrieg is not that there's some objective reality, including the minds of, the target population, and then you are manipulating the subjective states of a target population to distort their perception of objective reality. That's not what Weltanschauungskrieg means. And that kind of, reductive, tacit acceptance of materialism or of dualism is implicit to our notion of psychological warfare. But it's not at all the case with the original German idea. The original German idea, going back, through Nietzsche to somebody like Schelling, let's say, is that, the world shows itself in certain ways. And Heidegger, of course, develops a whole historical vision of how in different epochs the world shows itself in different ways. And so Weltanschauungskrieg is sort of working from within the dynamics of becoming, where it's impossible to draw any sharp distinction between the subjective and the objective. These are abstractions from out of some kind of flux that precedes that differentiation. You're working within the dynamism of becoming in order to shift the way in which the world shows itself, which is a partly unconscious process. You cannot do it entirely deliberatively. Okay, so to be a practitioner of Weltanschauungskrieg, you have to be engaging in a kind of occult art that works with the world to have the world show itself a different way, okay, to transform the meaning of being in a particular epoch. And the key to that is, of course, to understand the limitations of any given worldview or ideology that is structuring the way of life of one or another culture. So you cannot be what I argue in Black Sunrise, that essay in Lovers of Sophia that you referenced, is that you cannot be a practitioner of Weltanschauungskrieg if you are still blindly captivated by a particular ideology or worldview. And what made the deepest thinkers of the Reich so dangerous is that, contrary to the public misperception of them and the propaganda that we've, been fed for 70 years about these people, the deepest thinkers of the Reich, people like Otto Skorzeny, were not captivated by a particular ideology or worldview. They understood, what Nietzsche called perspectivism, perspectival thought, the ability not to act from out of an understanding of objective reality, some putatively objective reality, but to be able to flip back and forth between various perspectives. And, to understand the enemy's thought processes, to understand the, unconscious structuring principles of an enemy population from on the basis of their own terms, and from within their own perspective, and to be able to flip back and forth between different perspectival experiences of this becoming that we're all part of. So I think that, in a way, the Third Reich was the first postmodern political regime in being able to free itself. I mean, I'm talking at the highest think tank, level, not the rank and file, but to be able to free themselves from, blind adherence to any particular worldview or ideology, so that they can achieve dominance over rival populations and enemy states, and attempt to defeat them on a psychical level, not just a psychological level. So yes, Weltanschauungskrieg is connected to the idea of novel folklore, because, of course, the ultimate form of Weltanschauungskrieg would be to restructure the folkloric substratum of an enemy population.
Jason, I was wondering if you wanted to say something about why you call it Faustian futurist, because I know that a lot of our viewers are huge fans of Oswald Spengler, and as soon as they hear that phrase Faustian, they're going to be like, oh, what's this? So maybe we should clarify that.
Yeah, so the title Faustian futurist is based on a theoretical text written by my protagonist. This guy, Nikola, under a pen name, Nick Griffin, writes a book called Faustian Futurism. And he does it because he's basically trying to infiltrate a crypto-fascist elite, some tentacles of which he has discovered in New York City. And so he writes this book, Faustian Futurism, to get into their good graces. And what this text is an attempt to reconcile the tension between the opposed polarities of traditionalism and futurism in 1920s and 30s fascism. So he recognizes that you have this, traditionalist school that René Guénon and Julius Evola are exemplars of, and that a lot of people in 20s and 30s fascism, including circle around Adolf Hitler, inclined toward that type of traditionalism. Certainly the people who venerated Hitler after the war, like Savitri Devi, were, very unequivocal advocates of traditionalism and saw him as kind of like the Kalki avatar, the avatar of the Kali Yuga before the cycle of the ages ends in terminal decline and a new golden age, is on the horizon. So they have this cyclical conception of history where there can be no positive progress. All of the change that, and dynamism that's characteristic of modernity is nothing but devolution and deviation and subversion. And so they're radically anti-progressive. And then on the other hand, you have people like F.T. Marinetti, the whole futurist movement, which was in its own way extremely right-wing, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, but hell-bent on progress, and opposed to tradition to the extent that, Marinetti said insane things like that we should go into the Uffizi Museum and smash all the sculptures and tear up the paintings because they're chaining Italy to its past and they're hampering, the Italian genius, preventing it from a new flowering of the same productive power that it had in the Renaissance period, but a new flowering of that genius that would express itself in hypermodern forms. And so you have these people like Marinetti, and then also as a godfather, as a grandfather or predecessor, Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, who's in this, futurist kind of, who was part of this futurist current that coalesced into the fascism of the 1920s and 30s. So Nikolai sees this polarity between the fascist futurists and the traditionalist futurists, and he attempts to develop a kind of futurism that reconciles this contradiction, namely a Faustian futurism, which accepts the Faustian cultural character of the West as the indispensable precondition for futurist development. So, this is again Nietzsche's idea that you have to have a monumental conception of history where the roots of a people are deeply buried underneath the earth and the earth of the subconscious and their folkloric roots, and that this deeply rooted heritage has to be the ground for any growth and branching out, of this tree of a people's history as it reaches toward the sun of its destiny, of attaining its destiny, which is an idea that Heidegger then adopts from Nietzsche in Being in Time. So Nikolai sees the Faustian culture as characterized by Spengler, this devil's bargain to refuse to ever accept the present conditions as satisfactory, this refusal to be satisfied and to attain happiness in the present moment, and instead to strive for infinite expansion of horizons, to be devoted to perpetual discovery and ceaseless innovation. That characteristic that, Spengler sees reflected in Gothic architecture, and that I think you can make a case is is archetypally behind the development of the skyscraper, so that the skyscrapers of Manhattan are not, classical. They're not Greco-Roman. They are Gothic in their origin, and they're an extension of that same Faustian archetypal force that's behind Gothic architecture. Like, for example, when you look at the Woolworth building in New York, in Lower Manhattan, you can see that transition between, the Gothic spires of medieval Europe and then the skyscraper cities of America. So these characteristics of the Faustian civilization, as Spengler describes it, are recognized by my protagonist Nikola as the indispensable cultural substrate for any grounded, rooted futurist development. But in conclusion, it's worth noting that this is kind of paradoxical, because Spengler sees Faustian civilization as having entered a phase of terminal decline. And so, as he sees it, maybe there's one last period of Caesarism where, this civilization is going to cohere and ossify in some final form before it breaks up and is relegated to the dustbin of history together with other dead civilizations. So to speak of a Faustian futurism from a Spenglerian perspective is kind of paradoxical, because you are positing a future, an indefinitely open futurist developmental trajectory. You are positing that kind of a future for a civilization a civilization that has been characterized by Spengler as having already entered a phase of terminal decline. So in a way, the whole idea of Faustian futurism is an attempt to save the Faustian world from, being subsumed and from, completing this trajectory of terminal decline, to pull it up from out of this nosedive, and to basically secure the exploration and conquest of the stars as the destiny of the Faustian world.
There's a moment that some individuals who may not know why Spengler called this the Faustian civilization is because there's a moment in Goethe's Faust when Faust, and it occurs early on in the play, when Faust has just come out of his laboratory or his study, let's say, and he's out trying, it's on Easter morning, and he's trying to enjoy the revelries going on. They're out there all day, and Faust is out there with his sidekick, who's appropriately and presciently named Wagner. So they're out taking a stroll, and as the sun is going down, there comes a moment where they're at the top of a hill, the sun is going down, and Faust starts talking to the sidekick, and he says, what would be great is I would like to follow the sun. To see it not set, I would like to grow wings, more or less. And then he starts discussing this idea of what it would be like if he had the wings of a bird. And Goethe is actually, and this is, I think, even before balloons are taking off, or they might just be in the process of taking off and having this aerial perspective. And Goethe gives a very accurate description of an aerial perspective. He's looking down at the rivers and the meadows and the silvery streams and going across the earth and chasing the sun to the point it would never set, because it would be in orbit, ultimately around the earth, chasing the sun. And Wagner's response is the dull, prosaic response of the ordinary man who says, yeah, I don't have that. I get my kicks from turning pages in books. And Faust is like, you missed my whole point. And in a way, so Goethe captures in that moment this Faustian drive for the infinite. We are the one civilization who wanted to see the sun never set by chasing it around the earth and ultimately into orbit with our satellites around the planet. And that Gothic upthrust that you're talking about is first manifest in our cathedrals, with this idea to soar up into the infinite. That eventually leads, of course, to the creation of the skyscrapers, first in Chicago in the 1880s, and then in New York as a rival. New York apotheosized, which Chicago opened the door to. And then, of course, ultimately, the rockets that led us to the moon. So already, the wonderful thing about Goethe's Faust, it already captures in one single moment of Faust's daydream the entire future trajectory of the West. We're going to the moon in that speech right there. It's already pregnant with the seeds for that. And so it is a Faustian civilization in this sense. So I wanted to connect up your title with Spengler and the skyscrapers and the cathedrals. Because what we're talking about when we mention the word Faust.
That's perfect, because actually I believe that I quote that passage from Goethe's Faust in Faustian Futurist in a very poignant scene where the narrator, the protagonist, is, let's just say he's recalling his past life as Nikola Tesla. And he's remembering the moment when Tesla, as a young student in Prague, is walking through the park with his assistant, with his sort of sidekick. And he quotes a passage, this passage that you're referencing from Faust. And then it's at that moment that in a flash he gets the alternating current design. Which, Tesla was given to vivid, how could you put it, hallucinations. Okay, like these, Tibetan monks who can build whole mandalas in their mind and they see it, right in front of them floating out. So, like these augmented reality things that we have today, right? So Tesla, he recalls this passage from Faust, and it's at that moment that he sees the design of the alternating current, and he breaks a tree branch and draws it in the dirt. And that's his invention of the alternating current right there. And I have that passage from Faust in that context in Faustian Futurism, the Faustian Futurist.
Well, yeah, all that was amazing stuff. John, what you guys are both saying, that's my own work, that's the connection to cloud computing as the current expression of that drive for infinite space, at least symbolically or as an icon. Spengler talks about certain the paintings that start to show more of the sky, that show more space. He uses the term of the element of a soaring into the blue or into the beyond. And so it's interesting how I think we all have that in common, an interest in Faustian futurism, I guess. But also, Jason, what you were saying about Tesla, I actually have this book from comes out of the field of neuro-linguistic programming, and what they do is they have this methodology where they can model what people do internally that allows them to what their strategies, their cognitive behavioral strategies are that allow them to accomplish certain things. So there's one book on Tesla that uses his writings and shows you his mental strategies for how he would construct. He could build an engine, for example, in his mind. Just visually, like modeling it, he would factor in time and how the engine would run over time and how it might break down, and he could do all this in his imagination. And he also had these experiences as a child, sort of these fever dreams, where he would have these hallucinations, and it looks like eventually that became part of the strategy for being able to design these amazing machines. Well, one thing that I was hoping to get you guys to talk about as well is that John is doing, I think you just wrapped up, John, a series on Rudolf Steiner's Egyptian myths and mysteries, and you also did one on the outline of esoteric science, which gets into, both lecture series get into Atlantis and its importance in the destiny of humanity. And Atlantis and Atlantean civilization, the idea of a dual Atlantean identity, that perhaps some of us have memories of being being part of the ancient civilization of Atlantis. In Jason's book, there's even a sense of Lovecraft's old ones, the Tulu mythos, the sense that there is these titanic beings that are going to return to the earth, and that his stories sort of unfold that directly and sometimes indirectly, or mostly indirectly, but they have intimations of these beings that are going to return to the earth. And it's, in some ways, I think, Jason, your book, it sort of takes the old ones and replaces Lovecraft's titanic monsters with the Atlanteans. It's potentially maybe a real civilization that existed, maybe that even still exists in some form. If maybe only on the astral plane or something like that, if not also in potential hidden cities. But anyway, what I'm getting at was I just wondering if, I don't know, I'm wondering how much Steiner's viewpoint of Atlantis coincides with Jason's. I know Jason studied Steiner as well. I'm just curious if you guys could both kind of talk about that, Atlantis, and what you think about what that means as an archetype, as a potentially real thing, and so forth. Jason?
Well, I would say that there are a number of points of convergence between my portrayal of Atlantis in Faustian Futurist and what Steiner says about Atlantis. One of them is that this was a highly stratified hierarchical caste society. If I'm not mistaken, it's been a number of years since I've read Steiner on Atlantis, but if I'm not mistaken, you can refresh my memory, John. Steiner says that the Hindu caste system and other structures like the totalitarian pharaonic state in Egypt, these guru worship pyramidal social structures were reflections of the social structure of Atlantis, attempts to preserve it or echoes of it. And that's certainly an idea that I present in Faustian Futurist, where you have these surviving Atlanteans who have gone underground in Antarctica and also have facilities on the moon, and they intend to rebuild this hierarchical caste society on the ruins of the modern world. So that's one way in which my vision of Atlantis overlapped with Steiner's. Another is Steiner, I think very rightly, intuits that or recollects that the technology of this society was qualitatively different from our own. Atlantis was an advanced technological civilization, as Steiner portrays it, but it didn't have the kind of mechanistic technology that we have developed in the modern era. It had a different kind of technology based on a different metaphysics and worldview. And this is also an idea that, that's in the background of my novel, that you see these Atlanteans with types of technology that are advanced, but are very different from our own. So, for example, in Faustian Futurist, the Atlanteans have electricity. And in fact, their means for generating and broadcasting electricity is the world wireless system that Nikola Tesla proposed. And it's implied in my novel that Tesla actually did not invent world wireless. He was remembering it because he's a reincarnated Atlantean. But in any case, for example, the Atlanteans have electricity and they use it to power these hovercraft and other, submarines and flying machines and so forth that they have, some of which are also described by Steiner. But the Atlanteans do not use electricity for lighting. They use these phosphorescent stone spheres of various sizes on pylons, on pillars and so forth, in city squares and built into the sides of the streets and the sides of stairways and so forth, because this phosphorescent stone gives off a kind of ambient lighting that has a circumscribed radius. And this means that you don't have the type of glow of electric lighting over cities that we do, and therefore the stars are not blocked out at night. And in an Atlantean city, because the lighting is from these phosphorescent stones, you can see the stars as clearly as you would in the middle of a desert or on the top of a mountain.
Jason, would that correspond to the way that some reports of the interior of UFOs, some contactees or abductees report that there's a diffuse lighting around and there's no discernible light source? It's illuminated and it's in a certain variance, as you said. Do you think there's a connection?
It might be. The accounts that are closest to it are accounts of some of these individuals who claimed they went into subterranean cities. Like there's the Shaver mystery from the 1930s, I believe, where this guy in I think it was California, it was somewhere out west, claimed that he had found a passage into a subterranean city, which was illuminated by a kind of greenish glow, by these light sources that gave off a greenish glow. And interestingly, if you read the visionary writings of Shahab al-Din Sohrawardi from medieval Iran, Sohrawardi claimed that there were these hidden cities, Hurgalia, Jabarsa, and Jabalka. And Hurgalia, I think, is a corruption of Herculea. In other words, Herculean city. These hidden cities inside mountains where he said there was a green light inside them. They were, there was a light source inside these mountains, but this light source was not like our electric lighting or like daylight. It was like a green glow. So you have this Oz-like vision of these, magnificent cities hidden inside mountains in Sohrawardi. And you also have this green glow described in the Shaver Mysteries. It's an element that I've incorporated into this narrative. And that I think, to go back to your question, aligns with another element of Steiner's description of Atlantis, namely advanced technology, yes, but not of the kind that we have now.
Right, yeah. He describes their technologies as having power over the Earth's etheric body, which has to do with plants. Plants have etheric bodies, just as we do, but we also have astral bodies, but plants don't. And the etheric bodies are what the Atlanteans tapped into. He's very vague about the descriptions of Atlantis and their technologies, but he does say, yeah, you're right about this, that it's a different form of technology. But I've never been able to treat Atlantis as anything other than a mythos, a mythology. And my favorite book on this, by the way, is Jocelyn Godwin's Arctos, which is a book where he describes the popularity of the Atlantis myth among the Nazis, for instance, and how it gets diffused and disseminated. It's a really fascinating account. But I have yet to find a convincing explanation. I mean, Steiner says that he's vague about it too, and he doesn't give specific dates. He doesn't give any specific dates in his creation mythos until you get to India, the first post-Atlantean civilization, which he pushes back to 7000 BC, which is problematic. And so Atlantis would have to, presumably, since these are refugees from the Atlantean civilization, but probably, and traditionally, we would have to situate it for Steiner around 10,000 BC, somewhere in there. And he's always very keen on the precession of the equinoxes with these civilizations, so it would key into about the precession into Leo, roughly around that time. But he does say that there was a point where the Atlantic Ocean, the land at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean was above the sea, but the geology on that is for over millions of years, not over thousands or tens of thousands. So there are all these kinds of problems in Steiner. So I tend to treat Steiner's ideas more as a wonderful Tolkien-esque type of mythology, whereby he says that there was a water catastrophe at Sank, and then these refugees who had kind of lost contact with clairvoyant vision for the most part at the expense of the development of objective vision. They were starting to see things. The outer world was coming into focus in an objective way, so that they were preparing the way for the evolution of consciousness, whereby eventually each civilization that comes about in the post-Atlantean ages, starting with India, where the external world is an illusion, it's Maya, that starts to come into focus with Persia, 5000 BC-ish is the date he gives there, with the precessional shift into Gemini. Then it starts to come into focus the dualism between Ahriman and Ahura Mazda, the god of light. And the physical world is a real thing. It's just governed by a negative god, Ahriman. Then it moves down to Egypt, 3000 BC, where the physical world, the Egyptians are attaining mastery over the physical plane with all of their technologies. And then finally, the Greco-Latin civilization, which has completely lost touch with all of these clairvoyant abilities. And then it's the task then of our civilization, which is somewhat in resonance with the Egyptian civilization, to bring the ego into a fully developed state of self-conscious awareness to such a degree that no other civilization ever has. And this is, of course, the Faustian dream, mastery over the physical plane. This is one of the temptations of Christ, where the devil takes him up to a hill and shows him, you can have mastery over all of this. And that is the Faustian dream, mastery over the physical plane, but it's had at the expense, of a loss of contact with the spiritual world. But that eventually we would attain the spiritual realms again as the 6th and 7th post-Atlantean civilizations that are still to come will develop and keep the ego, keep self-conscious awareness, and combine it with spirituality and clairvoyant abilities that we will reclaim, that will come back into being, and the two will be fused together. Eventually, that becomes the ultimate goal of Faustian civilization. So that's in a kind of a nutshell Steiner's idea about Atlantis. Whereas the Atlanteans, the early ones, saw the outer world in a kind of mist or a fog. It just wasn't clear to them. So anyhow, the point I'm making is that I tend to see it as a myth, and I tend to not, with all of my historical studies, and I pushed them all the way back as far as they can go into the Paleolithic, I just don't see any evidence for any place that we could point to comfortably and say, there might have been Atlantis here. It seems like a myth that makes possible other ideas that come out of that myth that are very fruitful for other possibilities. So that's how I tend to see it anyhow.
Let me say a couple of things about that. Actually, the way in which my ideas on Atlantis and those of Steiner overlap in the most profoundly significant way is exactly in terms of what you were just outlining. This idea that the Atlantean mind was pre-rational, and the Atlanteans were able to develop this relatively, sophisticated civilization that they had on the basis of something like exquisite instinct or intuitive knowledge. They did not have the kind of rational faculties that we've developed over the course of our recorded history. Yes.
Psychic civilization.
They're a psychic civilization, one where telepathy and telekinesis were ubiquitous, but that also meant that they had a kind of collective consciousness and were relatively undifferentiated from one another. They did not have well-developed egos. And so one of the specters looming over this book is the danger of a potential regression of human society back to the sub-rational. Because these, surviving Atlanteans that in my novel, Atlantis is actually Antarctica. I go with that whole Colin Wilson, interpretation of Atlantis as Antarctica and so forth that comes from Charles Hapgood and all that. But be that as it may. These surviving Atlanteans in Antarctica still have minds that function in this way. In other words, they've gone into isolation, like North Korea or something. They're in some kind of like fortress state, isolated from the evolutionary trajectory of the rest of the planet. And they see what we've gone through as deviation and devolution. And they want to rebuild this Atlantean society, which, the protagonist sees as a horrific prospect because it would mean the regression of humanity back to a sub-rational state. Whereas, the reality is that we've actually outgrown Atlantean civilization. We have a lot of problems that they didn't have, but those problems are attendant to individuation and the development of the ego and, of the individual as distinct from a collectivist society, as distinct from, the kind of organic state that the Atlanteans had. So there's definitely this idea in my novel that's very close to Steiner's, the philosophical value of Steiner's use of the symbolism of Atlantis for talking about the evolution of human consciousness. That's definitely there. I also wanted to respond to your reference to the book Arctos, the polar myth, and the fascination that these ideas about Atlantis had for the Nazis and for other, fascists in early 20th century, early to mid 20th century Europe. I make a lot out of that in this novel. In fact, in a way, it's central. And I show that there are disturbing links between George Adamski and his associate George Hunt Williamson on the one hand, and fascist groups on the other. That there were American Nazis, for lack of a better term, the silver shirts, who were involved closely certainly with George Hunt Williamson, but then ultimately with Adamski, because George Hunt Williamson for a while became a kind of handler of Adamski. And in Faustian Futurist, I show how, George Hunt Williamson was a completely contrived, facade. He was a mask. He was an artificial persona created for this Michel Dobranovich character, who was military intelligence officer. And George Hunt Williamson was basically Adamski's handler. And Williamson had a history with these American Nazis. So this whole mythos that Adamski develops of these Nordic aliens, these tall blondes with the platinum blonde hair and so forth, and how they have achieved perfection and they're waiting to save mankind from its fallen condition and all this. It has not just fascist overtones, but there are indications that it's part of a basically Weltanschauungskrieg operation that began at the end of the Second World War.
That's also what I was referring to when I was using that concept. Exactly what you put it.
The parts on Adamski and George Hunt Williamson, or his real name Michel Dobrinovich, in this book are really creepy. They're liable to cause the reader to lose some sleep.
Yeah, and then just to clarify for the audience, Adamski was that guy who was he in California?
Yeah, he was in Palomar. He set up a whole commune at Palomar Gardens near the observatory.
He was one of the contactees in the 1950s, right before the abduction case began.
And what a lot of people don't know is that Adamski, before becoming the leader of a UFO cult, of a contactee cult, Adamski was the leader of a Tibetan esoteric cult. He came to Los Angeles in the 1930s to set up the first Tibetan monastery in America, as he put it, where he was going to teach Tibetan occult techniques, which he allegedly learned in the Himalayas. And I have to wonder whether George Adamski was in Tibet at the same time as Heinrich Himmler's people.
Yeah, he would also take photographs of alleged alien beings that were very beautiful, Nordic-looking people. That perhaps someone modeling, posing for photograph, could also take photographs of UFOs, but that I think many of them have been debunked as like just little models that he built or something like that. So, it's interesting. It's like with all of these examples of UFO stories, that kind of what I meant about how it's like you're building a myth out of, you're taking conspiracy theories as a kind of drawing upon it as mythology, and it's like in all of these stories, there's archetypal elements to them, not necessarily. There also might be factual elements. Perhaps all myths have, or at once, there's an old theory about myths being the retelling of down the ages of what great men accomplished, or something like that. Heroes, culture heroes, folk heroes. In a very tangled way, I guess I'm just trying to say it's cool how you're crafting a new mythology out of conspiracy theories and the archetypal images that are in them, and also potentially the facts that they contain.
I was going to throw in here. Godwin mentions in that book, Arthas, that there was a shift at some point in the Atlantis mythos, which was always traditionally set in the north, and sometimes got connected with the northern pole, hence the polar myth, the North Pole. But then at some point it got shifted to Antarctica, and it's been so long since I've read the book, I forget where the turning point was for that. But then it's interesting that Poe's novel, The Narrative of A. Gordon Pym, which he writes, in the 1840s, ends his novel with the ship creeping up on the coast of Antarctica, and he sees this man in a white robe coming out to meet them, and muttering some phrase that that's picked up by Lovecraft, of course, for At the Mountains of Madness, and he retains that phrase. I can't pronounce it, Tekeli or something. Tekeli, the old man was saying, and then Lovecraft picks that up, and then he sets at the Mountains of Madness there, where the explorers wind up discovering the ruins of an ancient civilization going way, way back. He doesn't say it's connected with Atlantis or anything, but the fact that the myth has shifted to Antarctica is a clue. And then, of course, that gets picked up for what eventually becomes John Carpenter's movie, The Thing, which is based on a short story by John W. Campbell from the 1950s, Who Goes There, which is a derivative of H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. So I was going to mention, I noticed that in the prologue, you had shifted also to this idea where we have it situated in Antarctica. So I'm wondering about that conscious shift in the mythology.
Yeah, well, when Atlantis is described as Hyperborean, as at the true north of the Earth, right? We have to keep in mind that the magnetic poles of the Earth reverse over very long periods of time. And there is no objective standard for designating one or another pole of the Earth, the north versus the south, other than the magnetic poles. So if Atlantis was a very long time ago, it may have been at a time when Antarctica was the northern magnetic pole of the Earth. There is no land at the north pole of the Earth. But when you're looking for a continent-sized island at the north of the Earth, namely at one of the poles, well, there's Antarctica right there, provided that it was at a period, like more than 10,000 years ago when the magnetic poles were opposite to what they are.
Interesting. Well, while we're done, no, go ahead. I was just agreeing with you. While we're on this, something I wanted to ask is that in the book there's a meeting between Tesla and a well-known Indian mystic guru. One, I wanted to know, was that a historical meeting?
Yeah, absolutely. They were friends. Tesla met Swami Vivekananda at one of Sarah Bernhardt's parties, and he engaged in a long, not correspondence, a long conversation and dialogue with him, where Tesla was learning these Sanskrit concepts like prana and akasha, and trying to develop a physics and mathematical model of nature that would incorporate these ideas. But then in my novel, the conversation that the two of them have, together with Sarah Bernhardt, who's also at the table at Delmonico's, Tesla's favorite steakhouse in Lower Manhattan, which is still there today. The three of them are at a table in Delmonico's, and it becomes an argument between Tesla and Vivekananda over the caste system, where Tesla is arguing against cyclical Hindu cosmology and the way in which it, grounds this, what Tesla considers unjust caste system, which doesn't honor true meritocracy.
Yeah, I was wondering, Vivekananda, by the way, was also 6 degrees of separation, was also an associate of Joseph Campbell's early in his career. I think before Campbell had written anything, Swami Vivekananda wanted him to edit his translations of the Upanishads, which are still amongst some of the best translations of the Upanishads. So I just thought I'd throw that little footnote out there for those who like footnotes.
Well, so this kind of connects to something else. I was going to ask. I was hoping that maybe you could elaborate on the disagreement they had in terms of reincarnation, and perhaps you can do that. But also, I wanted to connect to this, which is that in the book there's a really great, really powerful sequence of where you see what some of the potential consequences be of having recall of past lives, and how that might affect a romantic relationship, for example, which happens in the book. And so, yeah, I was just wondering if, and I know, John, you've also referred to this book as well, that Jason talks about in Prometheus and Atlas. I forgot the name of the doctor who did the study about past lives, the legal system. Ian Stevenson, right?
I was just suggestive of reincarnation. A book put out in the late 1960s, way on the scene before even Raymond Moody with the near-death experiences book in the 70s.
After that book, he came out with this massive 2-volume study called Reincarnation and Biology, which is just, it's a tour de force. I mean, I wish I could reach over and, the thing is like this. It's like this, okay? 2 huge volumes that are rigorous studies of the correlation between birthmarks and birth defects, and then the death wounds of children who recollect past lives. It's incredible. I mean,
I read a short paper with them talking about the birthmark idea, that they're karmic scars from wounds.
Yes.
So I remember him talking about a case where a kid was beheaded, and he had a birth mark going across his neck, and the guy clearly remembered being a kid who had been beheaded.
Yeah, there's an abridged version called Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect. That's a kind of, condensed presentation of the evidence from those 2 massive volumes. But yeah, I would challenge anybody to read, Reincarnation and Biology and tell me there isn't good evidence for reincarnation.
Right. Go ahead, Michael.
No, just for one thing I thought was interesting is the way you described the difference between the disagreement that Tesla and Vivekananda had about the caste system, it is about, on one level, secular level, I guess, it's about meritocracy. But there was also a deeper level I got in there. There's disagreement about karma, and I think Vivekananda is arguing that the caste system allows for karmic, proper for people's lifetimes according to what karma that they have and where they need to be, or something like that. And then Tesla was arguing for something different. And I thought that was interesting. I don't know if you can say more about that.
Yeah, sure. So, look, basically, I mean, there are at least there are three ideas here that are significant. One is that Tesla is arguing against Vivekananda that you can never be sure that someone who is philosophically cultivated, who is a refined, noble soul, who's a visionary, you can never be sure that that person is going to be born as a quote-unquote Brahmin. That reincarnation doesn't work in such a mechanical fashion. And it's that person's liable to fall through the cracks and be born as a merchant's son, or the son of a military officer, who, as a result of that, will be raised and trained as a soldier and never have an opportunity to express his own talents and to continue to cultivate his soul. So you're going to get the wrong people being born into the wrong caste. The system is not going to be perfect. It'll be far from perfect. And another problem that he has is that even if the system were perfect, that system is geared toward reinforcing human types rather than allowing for the cultivation of the human individual. The Kshatriya, the knightly caste, is a type. The Brahmin is a type. And so this whole system is not geared toward the cultivation of individual genius. And so a society that is structured in this way is going to be a regressive society. It's not going to be one engaged in innovation and various forms of creativity, which I think can also, to the extent that you accept any empirical evidence for Atlantis, if you were to look at the various archaeological structures that have been attributed to Atlantis by people like Robert Jacques and so forth, they're all strangely geometric and anonymous in their design. They don't express any individual genius. They're almost insect-like in the kind of mentality that they're embodying. The kind of crystalline precision characteristic of them is inhuman in a way that reflects the lack of individuation of the people in that society. So that's another problem that Tesla has, that even if the system were to work perfectly, it's a system that denies the development of the human individual and that reinforces types. And then finally, Tesla's problem is also that this whole system is based on a cyclical conception of time that's radically anti-progressive, where, there is no vision of a future that's going to be definitively better than the present or the past, right? I mean, Tesla's entire orientation as a Promethean, Faustian innovator was to help to bring into being a future that is definitively better than the present or any past epoch. Whereas the entire Hindu caste system, the cosmology and conception of time that undergirds that social structure is one that's regressive. It's radically regressive and sees, our best days as always having been behind us in the long lost golden age. And when this cycle completes its terminal decline and degeneration by the end of the Kali Yuga, the whole damn thing is going to come around. It's like a broken record where there's no, fundamental change ever taking place. And so that's Tesla's third problem with the caste system, is that the cosmology and cyclical time that's implicit to it is also deeply problematic.
Contrary to Tesla's argument, however, I would say this, that what I've learned from my researches into karma and reincarnation, and this isn't just from Steiner, some of Steiner correlates with this and some doesn't, is that when an individual reincarnates, they get a preview of the life that they're going to live, and they either agree to it or they don't before they incarnate. And if they don't if it doesn't match their karmic intentions and where they've been, it's not as random as Tesla's trying to make it out to be here. From my researches, it's not the case that if you're born an Einstein in one incarnation that you might be Forrest Gump the next time around. It doesn't work that way. There is a logic. There are logical threads that I've noticed that lead from lifetime to lifetime, where there's a kind of larger, you might call it a supra-personal lifetime, of which each incarnation is like a month in a year, let's say, so we wanted to put it that way. But there is a logic. From my research, there is a logic, and there is an agreement that the individual makes prior to incarnating, which would suggest then that if a person is born into the Shudra caste, or even an outcast, that person has already agreed to that fate prior to coming in. And I think that I'm not justifying the caste system because I think it's horrid. I think it's an abomination that should be done away with, and it is one of the aspects of Hinduism that I don't like at all. But nonetheless, it's there, and the Hindus might have a point that the souls who show up in these castes have already agreed before they incarnated to these fates, because it's karmic. There are certain lessons that can be learned. I've also learned, for instance, regarding races, there are certain lessons that can be learned from incarnating in one race, and I won't be specific, but there are certain incarnations that certain races allow for certain karmic lessons that other races don't allow. Same thing with the sexes. There are certain advantages and disadvantages to incarnating as a woman, and you're going to learn certain things that you can't learn incarnating as a man, and vice versa. So the game here, it does come with rules. There are limitations on what can and can't be learned, but it does seem that the individual knows what they're doing before they incarnate, and that includes however horrible the fate of the individual ends up being. They've already agreed to it coming in. So this is what I would say, against Tesla's. And Tesla is very much here defending a Eurocentric point of view. This is a West-centric progress model that he's defending here that the Hindus don't have, which is understandable. But yes, it's my point too. You're defending a bias here that may not correspond to the way things objectively are. Every civilization that has bias, gets things right and wrong. But so that's why I throw that out there.
Let me, just for the sake of clarification, I mean, that was a very clear exposition of Hindu ideas about reincarnation and karma. Just for the sake of clarification, let me just say that I don't disagree with the first part of what you said at all. There certainly is a logic to the evolution of individual consciousness across many lifetimes. And if you were Einstein in one life, you're not going to come back as Forrest Gump. The point that I'm making through Tesla as a character in the novel is that if you're Einstein in one lifetime and then, a caste system gets reestablished on Earth and you wind up being born the son of a merchant instead of being born the son of a Brahmin, there are going to be some serious constraints on your ability to express the level of understanding and the talent that you've cultivated thus far, let alone to be able to continue to cultivate it going forward. A lot of your abilities are going to remain latent. You're going to have a lot of frustrations and consequently a lot of resentments and so on and so forth that are going to potentially, they're going to render your life very convoluted. So that's what I would say with respect to the first part. The other ideas that, again, like I said, I mean, they're very, faithful representation of Hindu notions of karma. What I would say, and what I am saying through the character of Tesla in my novel about those ideas is that I find them deeply disturbing, not because not because I dismiss out of hand the idea that there may be beings who are monitoring and controlling and guiding the process of metempsychosis or reincarnation, but because I don't trust those beings in the least. And in fact, I portray them in Faustian Futurism. I have, and this goes back to certain ideas in Steiner.
Never trust anyone in authority.
Well, talk about authority. This goes back to ideas in Steiner and also in Gurdjieff that appear in this novel, where, you have these, Steiner talks about intelligent machines. that sort of like there are souls trapped in them, and these machines use the energy of souls to do certain things, but the souls that are trapped in these machines are, I mean, they're basically in a hellish, desperate condition where they've been stripped of their former humanity. And then Gurdjieff talks about how, the moon eats souls in a certain way. And these ideas are combined in my novel where you have these archontic beings on the moon who are capable of managing the process of reincarnation. And so these, John, would be your managers of the life review, right? They give you this, they show you, what this life of yours could be like or what that one could be like. And I don't trust, their algorithms. I don't trust their algorithms.
You guys do any better?
So, yeah.
So I'm going to throw out that reminds me of, I don't know if you had this in mind, it reminds me of the Manichaean myth where they say that the souls go to the moon,
yeah,
and it gradually fills up.
Yeah.
So once it's full, then it dumps into the sun.
Right, Jason, that part really affected me for some reason. That part of the book that I don't want to give any spoilers away about how that part happened, but there is this sort of tour of the moon, perhaps on the astral plane or something like that, and you see these, I guess the lunatics, right? That's how they're called in the book, and they have this technology that runs on souls. That's the energy source for it, and it just wears souls down. Like eventually, your soul can be worn down. And and then one thing they tell the protagonist is that the white light that you see upon death is actually a kind of trick. It's a deception of them. They want you to go into the white light because that's how they trap you into their machines, and they sort of trap you into sort of matrix simulations, basically, the impression that I got. And so they kind of so that was really powerful. That image really stuck with me. It did remind me of Gurdjieff, and also what John said about the moon filling up the souls. Wow, it was so cool how you did that. Which kind of goes to my earliest point in this talk about in that image about there's ideas about this one book I read, Who Built the Moon, which looks at evidence that the moon could be something that might actually be a spaceship that was parked there and for certain purposes. And that theory is also explored in Faustian Futurism. But it's amazing how you take this little episode that we're talking about, and it has all these mythic dimensions to it, and it connects all this stuff together, and but also corresponds to about the moon and what's happening there. So that I got to tell you that had such an impression on me, that sequence on the moon, that I had this dream that it was my birthday in the dream, and we were actually at like a dinner, right? And we're at a table, and then there's this light that starts flashing in our eyes, and it gets our attention, and then there's like this sort of kind of like a man in black shining a flashlight into our eyes, and then at that moment, I think either you remind me of this, or I remember from the book. It's like, oh, that's the light of that the moon people, the lunatics, used to trap the soul in these simulation machines. And that was all I remember. But it's just, like you were saying about how these images, these ideas appeal to these subconscious structures. And I think that your book does that in a really profound way of making novel folklore. And I think that if you read it, there's something very, even though it's a work of fiction, there's something like really persuasive about it. Like, is this, like, there's moments where it's like, is this about Jason? Is this really about did this really happen in Tesla's life? Is this really was there really for example, there's a remote viewing program that Nick works in, the protagonist in the Twin Towers. Was that something that really happened? So there is that, like you said, this sort of postmodern sense of doubt, doubting what's real, that happens in the book, but also this sort of programming of the subconscious, these mythic images, these folklore images. that stay with you for a long time. And that was one of the other things about the book, was that, and that's one of the power of these kinds of images, is that they stay with you in a way that other types of narrative don't. Just telling somebody something in a straightforward manner, or just giving information to somebody. We have a difficult time memorizing a phone number, so just giving someone rote information, they don't tend to input that as well as when you present them with a story, but even more so a story that has these archetypal, powerful images in them. Which I guess, unless there's anything else you guys want to add on to that, I guess that just reminds me of something else I wanted to ask, which is one thing I was doing, well, before we got on Skype today, was I was just kind of pulling out some themes from the book that I thought were significant, and I could pull off any more, but one was the theme of initiation, particularly through the erotic dimension, through sex mysteries, and also connection with initiation and trauma. And what I wanted to ask you was, well, there's at least a couple erotic relationships in the book that seem like they're more than just sex. In one instance, it even seems like there's some kind of sexual abuse that occurs. But these erotic relationships, they really seem like initiation rites in some ways. Like there's even one case where it does actually, I think, happen down in a cave underground. And it seems like the protagonist is being turned on to these so-called mysteries through these sexual encounters. And then this reminded me of, as far as the trauma goes, there's this correlation between early life trauma and sensitivity to psi abilities. Like, Kenneth Ring has looked into this with the Omega Project, and more recently Donald Kalshet, who's a Jungian analyst who studied trauma and how it kind of opens up the psyche to some transpersonal domain. And one of the ideas is that trauma leads to a reliance on dissociation as a coping mechanism, so people can they disassociate more often than other people do, which means they tune out of ordinary signals, which means that they can be more receptive to extraordinary signals that would normally be filtered out. So there's many allusions in the book, allusions, all of this kind of stuff, like initiation mysteries through the erotic, but also sexual abuse and trauma. Maybe this is getting too deep in, but
no, you put your finger right on it. I mean, everything you said is accurate. So the rather graphic erotic scenes in this novel are most certainly about initiation. Not just the one that takes place in an underground cave, covered by gorgons, images of gorgons and owls and so forth. The initiatic sexual experiences are also traumatic, and that trauma is used from early childhood, in the case of the protagonist, to crack open his mind and to catalyze extraordinary psychic abilities. It's probably not giving away too much to say that, it becomes quite clear in the course of reading this novel that this character, Nikolai, is I guess we could say victim of Project Monarch. He realizes that he's been subjected to lifelong mind control. And a lot of the narrative is him trying to find out who has been manipulating him all of his life and why. So he's caught in a kind of spider's web of manipulation, which involves erotic initiation, which is also an infliction of various types of trauma that are intended to cause a kind of superhuman mutation in this individual, because there are forces that want to use this man to accomplish certain aims in the world. They have a plan for him.
That's great. John, if you want to, you had a thought there.
No, I was just thinking about William Erwin Thompson's novel Islands Out of Time, which was the only novel he ever wrote that was also based on the Atlantis myth, and he also had a theme running through that of sexual tantric initiations. He had imagined on Atlantis that they might have these tantric cults that they would initiate individuals into to be part of the Atlantean esoteric sort of priesthood. I was just mentally riffing off of that. It's a very good novel.
Well, and this is another theme that I thought was really important in the book. I hope this isn't too much like a literary review or something.
No, it's good. It's good. Go ahead.
But duality, I thought, was an important, very important theme of the book. At the narrative level events, for example, the official or mainstream narrative, like that we get from mainstream news, versus secret, occult, or conspiracy narratives. So, for example, there's dual histories suggested in the book, alternative histories of human and civilizational origins. There's also duality in the characters. The protagonist, his mother has a twin, described as a doppelganger, who becomes his adoptive parent. So he has a dual origin, two sets of parents, which is also an archetypal motif. And Freud and Jung both examine that. John, maybe you can fill us in on that more. And then his father, Nikola, has a secret. His father has a secret Ukrainian identity, but he wants to be tagged as a Russian KGB operative by the McCarthy-era FBI. So, and this goes through the book in a lot of different ways. Like people have a dual Atlantean identity, either from the present life or the past life. And then one thing I thought was really cool, and then I can turn it over to you guys, was that I thought that the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, sort of was a symbol, I thought, that kind of captured all of this together, where the protagonist works for this remote viewing project, which I want to ask you more about remote viewing as well. And this is what I'll finish with, is that reminds me of David Lynch, the title for his show, Twin Peaks, which has a double meaning, referring to the geographical features of the region, but also to taking a second peek or a second look, a double take, to see what's behind the curtain of this small town. In that television show, the darkness that's actually underneath it. So the Twin Towers kind of reminded me of the Twin Peaks and illustrating this theme of duality. So, yeah, do you want to say anything more on that?
Listen, I'll say something which no one's going to understand what I'm about to say right now, but it will be a little time capsule, and eventually, it'll, people will unpack it. But a number of things you just said are connected in an incredibly bizarre way that you'll probably get where I'm going with this. But in the third season of Twin Peaks, there is this reference to Odessa. The doppelganger of Laura Palmer is in Odessa. And, the Nazi bell shows up in the third season of Twin Peaks. It's this bell-shaped device which is on this otherworldly location. We don't know if it's another planet or whatever. David Bowie's voice is coming from out of it. And it's connected to all this about electricity, the electricity that's associated with Bob and the Black Lodge. And, the pattern on the floor of the Black Lodge, it's the SS lightning bolts within the red curtains. It's the whole Nazi color scheme of the red with the black and white SS lightning bolts connected to the electricity, connected to the bell that David Bowie's voice is coming from out of. And David Bowie was a self-identified fascist in the 1970s, et cetera, et cetera. But Odessa, in particular, where the doppelganger of Laura Palmer is living in the, season 3 of Twin Peaks, a woman who essentially, when she's discovered by Cooper and so forth, it's portrayed that she has a false identity, that like a false identity has been constructed for this woman, and that there are all these people who are living with false identities. Okay? Now, there's a connection between Odessa, Texas, and another Odessa, where false identities were created for people who are in hiding. Namely, Odessa, the organization of former SS officers, the acronym of which in German is Odessa. That organization was also informally known as the Spider, or Die Spinne. It is the post-war fascist international. So there's a connection between Twin Peaks and, as you were saying, the role that Ukraine plays in this novel, because the majority of people recruited into Odessa, or Die Spinne, the Spider, were from Eastern Europe, and particularly Ukraine, because the anti-Russian, anti-Soviet Ukrainian nationalists were the sort of cornerstone and linchpin of the Nazi efforts in Eastern Europe. And when the CIA was formed, it was formed by merging the OSS with the Gehlen organization namely the Nazi Eastern European spy network. Again, the majority of whose operatives were Ukrainian. Ukrainians were particularly useful in the post-war period because they could pass as Russians. So what the CIA did was they took a bunch of Ukrainians who spoke fluent Russian but were Ukrainian nationalists, and they created false identities for them as KGB operatives. And this figure of the narrator's father, the protagonist's father in Faustian Futurist, is one reference, to that whole situation in 1950s America, where you had, and I think actually Lee Harvey Oswald was one of these people, that Lee Harvey Oswald was not a communist or any communist sympathizer or anything. Lee Harvey Oswald was an agent of the Spider, and he was being passed off as someone under suspicion of being a communist. So you have these Ukrainians who were recruited into an organization called Odessa, the acronym of Order of Former SS Officers, which interestingly enough is also the name of a city in Ukraine, the city of Odessa, which then appears in Twin Peaks Season 3 as the place where, Laura Palmer under a false identity is living, having seemingly forgotten her past, her traumatic, awful past, namely the past of the Nazis who had false identities created for them by the CIA. Right? And so I think that David Lynch actually knows what's going on here. He's someone who's in the know about this whole post-World War II fascist international and its spider web that it's, weaving over the planet. So that's my
unconscious mind, I think.
It's possible, but I think that you can't come up with this without some very conscious, knowledge.
There's a difference between a Thomas Pynchon type and a David Lynch type. They're two totally different types of artists. He's not. He doesn't use his neocortex when he creates.
I really think he taps into.
It's like he's drinking while he's like,
transcendental meditation is what he uses to catch big ideas. He calls them like big fish. He goes into this meditative state and gets these ideas, and then he unfolds. Like the movie Lost Highway, for example. When they wrote the screenplay for that, he didn't even know what it was going to be about. Like he liked the term Lost Highway. He liked the idea of a lost highway, and then it just unfolded from that, as though it already sort of existed in the unconscious mind, and you just had to I think that a lot of these artists they get intuitions, and they're sort of half understood, and they see they see connections between things, and that helps them tangle them together without necessarily knowing what all the facts are that plug into it, But you really well may be right. Too in the know. I read this thing. It was an anonymous, just a Reddit post about what Twin Peaks, their third season, was about, and I thought it was really profound. And it was this whole idea, and it was brilliantly written about how it's really a commentary on television and how we sort of live in. Because Twin Peaks was a television show, and then all the references to electricity and the telecommunication wires, and that the different identities have to do with like actors versus people on a show, and the sort of idea that we're sort of all on TV in the internet age, in a sense, that we've all kind of been uploaded into and that there's like it connected with John's idea of dead celebrities living icons, of digital avatars that are sort of that are reminiscent of astral spirits, but then actually might be sort of like there can be astral entities somehow, or like what your concept of, I guess it's Mark Stavish uses this term, the egregor that can be launched through. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point, but anyway, yeah. So where were we?
Let me just comment on, because that little riff was again something that 95% of people are just not going to make heads or tails out of. But I'll say something a little bit more concrete in response to the questions you were raising earlier. The Twin Towers in the novel, right? They are a location where naval intelligence has a super secret remote viewing program. And basically, the idea here is that,
This is what I wanted to ask. Is that only in your book, or is that possibly real as well?
Quite possibly real. So what happened is this, that, the CIA funded SRI, funded the Stanford Research Institute, particularly Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, to develop this remote viewing program on an experimental basis, which then the CIA, by the end of the 1970s, made operational. Okay? So it was developed at SRI, and then it was made operational at the CIA, and it changed hands a number of times. At one point, it was, run by the Defense Intelligence Agency, by the, NSA people were involved at one point. It moved to Fort Meade at one point. In any case, there was this officially funded, let's say. It wasn't officially acknowledged, but it was officially funded, congressionally funded remote viewing program that was terminated in 1992 or so, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it ran from the early 70s through to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Would this have been a continuation of SRI?
Right, exactly. Now, it's been rumored, based on things that have been said by people in positions, that would allow them to know that this is the case, that there was a parallel program, that the CIA program that was initially developed at SRI was basically a recruitment facility to identify people who are not only exceptionally talented, but who would be loyal enough to carry out operations that were, let's say, very unconstitutional. Okay, and that were much more morally ambiguous than the kinds of operations that were being carried out in the CIA program, that Project Stargate, that, as I said, changed hands a number of times.
Project Stargate, yeah.
And Pat Price is said to have been one of the early remote viewers who was recruited from out of the CIA program into this even deeper black project, which continues to this day. A program which was never shut down, it was never defunded after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and continues to this day. And in my novel, this program is run by naval intelligence, and it's based in the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. And there's some reason for having it be run by naval intelligence. Hal Puthoff was involved with naval intelligence, not just with the CIA. He had a background in the Navy, and he was involved with naval intelligence. And what I suggest in this novel is that he wasn't telling Russell Targ everything. And he was acting as a kind of liaison between the formally funded program and people in naval intelligence who were basically using that program to recruit talent and to find exceptionally loyal and committed individuals who would be willing to engage in much more controversial remote viewing work for them. And in the novel in particular, Nikola is one of a group of remote viewers tasked with clairvoyantly describing UFOs as they enter and exit the oceans of the world. So he's tasked with following these UFOnauts as they go down under the oceans into submarine and subterranean facilities, and also follows them to their layers on the moon.
Yeah. I'm glad that you said that, because I wanted to ask you about the remote viewing stuff. So that's great. That stuff is really fascinating, and the way that you kind of it's like you take the reader into that whole world.
By the way, let me just add on to that, I don't know how many people are aware of the fact that one reason why the World Trade Center was targeted on 9/11 is because about, at least 20 floors of the World Trade Center were run by the National Security Agency. This is a little known fact that one of the most important NSA, maybe the most important NSA facility anywhere other than Fort Meade, was in the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. So that was a prime intelligence target. The information that was destroyed when those towers came down, we don't know where it might have been backed up or whether it was backed up, and what kinds of things could have been covered up by destroying that facility, or whether, as some people have speculated, if the towers were brought down in a controlled demolition, it may have been that there were charges pre-planted in the towers by the NSA in the eventuality that, should the facility be at risk of being compromised due to a successful terrorist attack, they themselves would have to bring the tower down, because otherwise those 20 floors would be vulnerable to infiltration and a retrieval of information.
The only plausible version I've ever heard of defense of the U.S. demolishing the towers. The controlled demolition.
Yes, it was a high-value intelligence facility, and so even the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, you remember the one with the basement levels? Had that attack been successful, the towers probably would have had to be brought down in a controlled demolition simply to protect those 20 floors of the NSA.
There are some people that say, I guess it's like kind of a new conspiracy theory, that the Nashville bombing explosion involved an electromagnetic pulse that meant to disrupt, destroy some of the data stored on the hard drives of the AT&T building, and apparently there was the Dominion of voting systems was involved, or used to be involved, particularly in that building, and it has under a different name, and it was a different company, and so they were trying to they detonated that to take out that information somehow, kind of like what you're saying about the Twin Towers thing has been taken down so people couldn't get access to that information. I don't know how the veracity of that is, but what do you think about that?
What, the Dominion scenario in Nashville?
Well, maybe we can hold this off for a little later.
Yeah.
I did want to kind of connect to today and 2020 and future, but maybe how much time do we? We're over an hour and a half.
Yeah, I mean, another maybe 15, 20 minutes or so.
Oh, okay. Okay, so maybe we can. Well, how would you guys feel? Because I know you guys both have thoughts about what's happened in the election, the temporary situation. Maybe this is bad enough. I don't know. I would save that for another
Yeah.
session. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, one thing that I thought was interesting was that, and that I think is significant, and maybe some people will find this interesting, maybe not, but I thought that it's the sort of idea of, one thing about the book was that I sort of was thinking about what is there an antecedent to this book, and immediately what I thought of was Robert Anton Wilson, Robert Shea's book, Illuminatus, that came out. It's a trilogy that came out, I think, mostly in the 70s. And I sort of felt like this book could be, for the post 9/11 or the post Trump era, something similar to that book and how it affected people, because mostly how they construct narratives out of conspiracy culture. And I think they do so in a different way. And I actually think this is a good demonstration of the difference between what me and John call postmodern and hypermodern literature. If you don't mind me finishing this part, which is that it has to do with the change in attitude towards meta-narrative and narrative generally, right? So, for example, there's just cynicism, skepticism about overarching grand narratives that we associate with postmodern, or a diversity of minor narratives, and so forth. But Wilson's Illuminatus has often been called a postmodern novel. But I would say that the way Wilson and Shea use conspiracy theory compared to the way Jason does in Faustian Futurist can illuminate the distinction of this change in attitude from post to the hyper, which is a change in attitude about meta-narratives. So what I'm saying here is that in Illuminatus, the narratives, these conspiracy narratives are used to overload the narrative to the point that it explodes into multiple parallel stories, and it's often done in a satirical way, deconstructive way, which is in keeping with this tonal attitude of skepticism about narrative. But what I thought was really significant about Faustian Futurists was it actually uses conspiracy narratives in a way that is similar, like I said earlier, to how the modernists drawing on mythology, like Thomas Mann, T.S. Eliot, drew on mythic narratives. It doesn't use them as Luminatus does to deconstruct the form of the novel. It draws on them to actually reconstruct it into a single narrative, sort of tying together all these conspiracy narratives into a new narrative, like a new modern mythos, and sort of manages to weave the imaginary and the real together in this integral reality narrative. I thought that was really significant. It kind of reminded me of like one thing that John talks about a lot is that someone like Jordan Peterson is popular today because he talks a lot about the importance of mythic stories as a way to restore order and meaning to life, to deal with the chaos of our time and sort of repairing of deconstruction of the sort of postmodern discourses. So I guess what I'm getting at is that I think that's significant how it's maybe even contrary to what you were saying earlier about this being a postmodern novel, which I certainly can see that. I like this idea of seeing it as, rather than deconstructing narrative in the way that Illuminatus does by overloading the narrative with conspiracy theories that break out to multiple parallel stories, this sort of ties them all together in this coherent narrative, like a new story, a new myth. So I don't know if you've heard anything in that.
Yeah, definitely. I'll tell you what I think about that. You're right to draw the contrast insofar as I can imagine that Robert Anton Wilson's main aim was deconstructive, that, it was mainly deconstructive. Whereas what I'm doing in an attempt to develop a novel, Folklore, is constructive, but one has to recognize that my constructive project is also deconstructing a potential meta-narrative that is in a process of development. So I want to be a little careful how I phrase this here, but if you go all the way back to Prometheus and Atlas and look at my body of work since then, there is an engagement with a rising meta-narrative, okay? So it's lost on a lot of people that we have moved beyond the era of pure deconstruction and negative postmodernity into an epoch where a new meta-narrative is being constructed by a group of people with whom I was very tangibly involved, okay, in a political sense. And so, yes, there's a constructivism in my work that, is distinct from the purely deconstructive writing of let's say, Illuminatus. But I'm also employing a type of deconstruction insofar as I'm attempting to change the meta-narrative that's being formed while it's still in an embryonic stage.
Yeah, right. So that's kind of like, what is it, inside baseball? Or sort of. I understand what you're talking about, totally. But that actually is sort of folded inside of the book, the idea that Faustian Futurism is a manifesto that Nikola, the protagonist of the book, writes to infiltrate this into a fascist group, as we've described it, which I thought was really fascinating. And that's actually why I wish I had the book here next to me. Can you guys, Jason, can I just take 1 second, John?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is exactly what I would like to finish on. This gets us into some of Faustian Futurism, the manifesto, the dissertation that he wrote in the book, and its predictions for the future, which were really chilling. And it's, I think we should go over some of those, and then we can wrap it up with that, if that would be okay.
Sure. Go ahead.
You guys talk amongst yourself. Yeah, talk about Brutus Faust and so forth.
Is this your first foray into fiction?
Yeah.
Are you going to do more? Do you have plans to follow this up?
I would love to. And actually, I could even imagine, I mean, there are standalone stories that, I would want to write, but I could even imagine this becoming an installment in some kind of a trilogy. But, it's a question of, look, let me put it to you this way. I think Heidegger was really onto something when he described being toward death as a fundamental existential structure, right? That gives you a sense of urgency and priorities in life. And so, it'll depend very much on what my life is like over the next few years, whether I'm afforded the opportunity to be able to indulge in writing fiction again, of the kind that I have here.
Well, you're still young, Jason. So I think your being toward death is a little premature.
Yeah, well, Camus was young too. Anyway, so was Kafka.
Barring accidents.
Well, I accidentally grabbed this book first, which I'm actually just want to ask, what do you think about this case, the Andreessen affair, Betty and Andreessen?
Yeah, I think it's one of a number of great examples of terrible psychological manipulation on the part of these entities, particularly the introduction of false religious belief systems into mass consciousness. I mean, this woman basically became a religious prophetess. She
was already very religious. She was a devout Catholic, I thought, and so was Fowler, who hypnotized her. Right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the chicken or the egg. I mean, why do they go after people like this, who they realize that they can use to promulgate some kind of a cult? I think Joseph, what's his name, Smith. Joseph Smith was one of these characters too, going all the way back into the 1800s. His angel. Now I'm going to get myself in trouble with the damn Mormons. But the angel Moroni that appears in the blue light in Joseph Smith's bedroom at night, I think that fits on the same trajectory as Betty Andreessen and any number of the Raelians and any number of other individuals whose contactee experiences resulted in the formation of some kind of cult.
Right. And just like an illustration, because this is in your book, you talk about how the alien greys, for example, are basically robots, and that they're built by these Nordic Atlanteans, essentially, right?
Yeah.
You can see this all in her drawings in this book. You can see the little gray aliens. For example, here's this encounter she had as a child that she drew of this alien gray, and it's actually, she describes those as buttons. Like, it has buttons on it that do things, right? So it kind of has a robotic character, but you can also see her walking with these beings. There's a bigger picture of it. But you can also see her walking with these little beings and these tall humans.
Yeah, look, I don't trust these people. They tell one guy they're from Venus. They tell another guy they're from Mars. They tell some woman they're from the Pleiades. According to one of them, we should return to the Vedic pantheon. According to another one, they're emissaries of Jesus Christ. These people are promulgators of various lies and deceptions.
Which Vallée says they're messengers of deception.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he even discovered that they use even hypnotic principles in some of their communications, like Milton Erickson, the hypnotist that I've studied a lot, invented this thing called the confusion technique. And Vallée shows how some of these encounters, like confusing things they say to people, the paradoxical statements, are similar to the principles that operate in Erickson's confusion technique, which is meant to create a state of disorientation that can render somebody suggestible to ideas. So there's hypnotic principles going on in that.
Yeah, I mean, this is why, as I stated in Prometheus and Atlas, I have become convinced that they're really from Uranus. And, I'll be damned if I'm going to allow, our world to be, enveloped by Uranus. So,
Are you making a joke right now?
What do you think?
They're Uranian, like they're Promethean from planet Uranus.
No. Look, there was this episode in the 60s, I believe, where the CIA sent some people to talk to a Miss Keach, who was a channeler, claiming to be receiving messages from Uranus, from entities in Uranus. And Look, as I said in Prometheus and Atlas, in my chapter Mercurial Hermeneutics, I think that's the right answer right there. They're from Uranus. They're not from Mars or Venus or, yeah.
Right.
They're major assholes, and we should not surrender to them. We should insist on defining our own destiny as a people on this planet.
Yes. And what Faustian futurist made me think about was, you really can see, to your point earlier, about there's a nascent meta-narrative that's building, and that this is contributing to that process somehow. And it makes me think about some of Vallée's earlier speculations about this UFO religion being the religion of the future. This ties right into the epilogue of the book as well, about that we should be careful, because in a similar way that, so let's say, Christianity was able to convert the Roman Empire within a couple hundred years, few hundred years or so, it might seem far-fetched to us today, but it's not so far-fetched, particularly with what we see going on in the mainstream news now about these UFO events that are being reported. It's not so far-fetched to see this as a future religion that could happen, and that people could be that could control how things are run on the planet, control our belief system. And so this leads into some of the ideas you have here, some of the predictions, which are not necessarily your predictions, though they do connect with stuff that you said in World State of Emergency. But you just have this chilling description of, I don't know if you put it this way, but it sort of suggests that perhaps COVID is kind of like just the tip of the iceberg. People think we're going to go back to normalcy, but that's the tip of the iceberg of many catastrophic changes. That things are going to get we're going to continue down this trajectory, and it's all kind of leading up to a situation where the Western world, and perhaps the world generally, is so devastated and so at war and so morally bankrupt, or the morale is so low that these Atlantean beings that are associated with the abduction UFO phenomena, we will be vulnerable to them coming down and seeing them as angels who say, hey, we can give you a better world, we can help you, come out of this if you worship us, essentially. And I was hoping you can elaborate on that much better than I can.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. What I show, there's an epilogue. Okay, there's a prologue that's in Atlantis, takes place in Atlantis. Then there's an epilogue, which is called How the Modern World Ended. And it's not really fatalistic, because the whole point is that the protagonist, Nikola, who is someone who's already shifted us from a horrible alternate timeline into the history that we're living in, right? He's someone who has a precedent as a remote viewer of having helped to change history for the better, right? The protagonist, Nikola, is attempting to prevent this future that's depicted in the epilogue from coming to pass. So my intention is not to be fatalistic when I lay this out, right? The point is to make people conscious of these possibilities so that we can conjure a better future into being. But in this epilogue, How the Modern World Ended, as you suggested, I say that COVID is just the beginning of a long process of artificially engineered and convergent catastrophes that are going to include things like engineered climate change, using HAARP and other technologies to catastrophically change the climate and pretend that it was some natural calamity, triggering artificial earthquakes in places like La Palma, and earthquakes that will have attendant tsunamis that are utterly catastrophic. Like also, for example, the Cascadia subduction zone. I depict the engineering of an artificial earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone that, drowns Seattle and Portland and Vancouver and so forth. So there are all these catastrophes, pandemics, other genetically engineered diseases and bioweapons, artificial earthquakes and attendant tsunamis, artificially engineered climate change using HAARP, which then, of course, leads to famines and droughts, mass starvation, the spread of diseases through areas where there is famine, and basically the drastic depopulation of the earth as a result of all of this, and mass hopelessness and despair, all of which is used to create a condition where people are ready to accept saviors from above. And these Atlanteans then can emerge not as conquerors of the planet, not as some kind of alien invaders, but as the rescuers and guides of humanity. And I have a particularly chilling vision of how the Chinese agree to be used as middlemen and as a kind of managerial class that sort of frames these Atlanteans as the wise Confucian ancestors, right? So these, the Chinese, unlike people in the Western world who subscribe to an Abrahamic belief system, and unlike the Muslims, the Chinese stand to lose a lot less through the disclosure of this, so-called alien presence, whether it's in Antarctica, on the moon, Mars, wherever. Their belief system is not going to be as affected by it as the religious belief systems that are based on revelation and on prophetic history. So the Chinese are uniquely positioned to guarantee security and order and stability, which of course, and collective cooperation, which of course are ideals that are particularly significant in Confucianism. And so the Atlanteans are framed as these Confucian elders and the great ancestors of mankind, and the Chinese wind up playing a role comparable to the role that the Raj played in India for the British. They're these, indigenous people who are traitors to their own folk. They sell out the earth. The Chinese are portrayed as having sold out the earth to the Atlanteans the same way that the Raj sold out India to the British. And they accept the position of a kind of a managerial governing class that does the bidding of the Atlanteans. And I think that this is a possibility that seriously needs to be considered when you think about the Chinese now venturing to the moon and to Mars, and the possibility that the Chinese may take a very different position on UFO disclosure than the Americans or the Soviets did. Namely, that the Chinese position would be, we're not going to actually hide this from the population of Earth. When we put men on the moon, we're going to show them the structures that are on the moon. We're going to show them the structures on Mars when we make it to Mars. And we're going to cut a deal with the people who are there to be the, interface, the agency for disclosure and for, the guidance of humanity into a postmodern epoch in the terrible sense of the word postmodern.
Do we have any record of sightings in China? Because
many.
There are. Okay, you just don't hear about them.
Yeah, there are now huge Chinese UFO organizations, actually.
Okay.
And one thing you said, John, go ahead.
No, that was my thought.
Just one thing that I thought was really fascinating in that part was about how the disclosure of these ancient Martian civilizations, which perhaps the base on Mars, was that in the 1970s?
Yeah. 76, yeah.
Is a sign of an artifact of that will create it'll pretty much end the whole Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, and it'll even create perhaps a kind of revenge against the proselytizers of those religions when people realize that there's this, that all of that was a lie, essentially. The whole Bible is just really, there's, I don't know, do you want to say anything about it?
No, well, exactly what you just said. And look, if that were to happen, it would precipitate the total social disintegration of Western civilization. I mean, you would have mass psychosis at a time when the Chinese are spearheading the development of all kinds of singularity level technologies, and in a situation where the Chinese collective belief system is positioned to weather that kind of disclosure much better than we are going to be able to. So this is one of the reasons why I see China as a grave threat, because they have a type of belief system that is not going to be as fundamentally undermined by these kinds of disclosures, and a type of belief system that emphasizes order and stability and cooperation. And I think that if the West undergoes this kind of psychotic, traumatic disillusionment with the Abrahamic revelation, the Chinese are going to be left effectively governing the planet, albeit, I think, at the behest of and on behalf of, this occulted Atlantean elite.
It's wild stuff. And wow.
The other thing is, let me just add this on as a closing note, perhaps. Race is a significant theme in this book. Race and the fascist connections to Adamski and the whole contactee mythos developed by George Hunt Williamson and George Adamski. And one thing that's particularly concerning to me in terms of the role the Chinese might play in these developments in the middle of the 21st century is that, you see, if a bunch of titanically tall, blonde, Hyperborean saviors were to emerge on the earth, and their interface were something like Nazi Germany, it would immediately be attacked as some horrific white supremacist conspiracy to subject the other, populations on the planet to totalitarianism. Now, if the Chinese are the ones who put these people in front of the global media, and the Chinese are the ones who are telling the poor Westerners who've just been disabused of all their revealed religious belief systems, oh no, they're the ancestors, they're the fathers and mothers of all humanity. Okay? That's going to be swallowed a lot better by non-white populations. If you have a non-white race of people be the intermediaries who basically accept the assistance of this group on behalf of humanity and on behalf of the planet, that'll be a lot less subject to criticism as some kind of a white supremacist conspiracy. And I find that deeply troubling.
All right, Jason, where can we get your book? Is it on Amazon?
It's published by Arctos. It is fulfilled through Amazon, even if you order it at Arctos. So I would suggest people just go to Amazon. And as with all my other books, there's a link to it in the books tab of my website, jasonrezageorgiani.com. There's a books tab, and there's a link to all of my books on Amazon.
Well, one last thing, just so we don't end on such a grim note for going into the new year, which is that the book does, and you said this earlier, that something about remote, that the book does have the possibility that we can change the future, right? And that's kind of what it's really about. Like, even by remote viewing certain events, Nikola is able to change the outcome. At one point, he thinks that there's going to be a nuclear war. Something like that is going to happen with Iran, I think, at one point. But he's able to change history by observing it. And I kind of got the impression that the epilogue, in a way, gives us that opportunity by sort of remote viewing this possibility.
That's the point, and that's why I have this alternate history in there, where Nikolai sees the Third World War between the United States and the Soviet Union being catalyzed by the invasion of Iran in 1980. The Soviet invasion of Iran in 1980, where there's a communist revolution fomented in Iran by Soviet agents. And so Nikolai gives this intelligence back to his employers, and they decide to orchestrate an Islamist revolution in Iran so that it will be the form that the resistance to the Shah takes instead of a communist revolution, and so that the Soviet Union cannot invade Iran. Because in this alternate history, Richard Nixon has remained in power, and he has supported the Shah in the Shah's efforts to develop nuclear weapons. And this is all based on actual historical information that a few people know about in terms of Nixon, the Shah, discussions over a nuclear deterrent inside Iran, and so on and so forth. And so the implication is actually that Nixon was also removed from office because the continued presidency of Richard Nixon would lead to Iran developing nuclear weapons and create a situation where, should the Soviet Union invade Iran, and that was clearly the objective of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It had nothing to do with Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a forward position and staging ground for eventual Soviet invasion of Iran. So should the Soviets invade Iran and the Shah had nuclear weapons, there's a strong case to be made the Shah would have used nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union in a kind of suicidal, give me liberty or give me death kind of approach toward handling a Soviet invasion. He had made various statements in interviews suggesting that he would never tolerate another Soviet invasion of Iran of the kind that took place in 1946. So there is this alternate history presented there, and Nikolai shifts it into the timeline that we're living on now. So the whole point with the epilogue is, just as you suggest, to call us to conjure a better future than that one into being.
And for the new year, that's the purpose of the book, conjure a better future into being. That's great. So, John, you want to take us out?
All right. Happy New Year. That was wonderful. That was a great time, guys. That was a very fast 2 hours that just went by. I enjoyed that.
Likewise. It was fantastic. Thank you, guys.
Jason, good luck with your book, and I hope that this is the first in a series of more novels for me.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, you're welcome. Absolutely.
And Michael, I will hopefully see you before too long.
Yeah, you'll be out in LA. All right, you guys. Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Thanks so much. Happy New Year's.
Happy New Year.